Welcome to part 2 of the Unsinkable Titanic. In part 1, I talked about the building of the massive ship, the theories as to why and how the allegedly unsinkable Titanic had slipped beneath the icy waters in a terrible, tragic, and preventable event. I will also get into discussing the major players, the perceived heroes, and the perceived villains, as well as the horrendous implosion of the Titan in 2023. Whose poorly engineered design led to the violent and instantaneous death of the 5 individuals. I encourage you to go back and listen to part 1 before getting into this episode. This is part 2 of the Unsinkable Titanic. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. Let's go back to the unsinkable Molly Brown. After the shipwreck, she started a committee for the survivors. She helped plan burials for the bodies that were recovered, and she even gave an award to the captain of the Carpathia for saving the survivors. Don Lynch, the historian for the Titanic Historical Society, said about Molly Brown that, quote, "She was also vehemently upset that she was not able to testify at the Titanic hearings at the inquest because she was a woman," end quote. Wallace Hartley was also another historical figure. He was one of the men who was playing the violin as the ship went down. He and his band continued to play, despite knowing that they were going to go down with the ship. Lynch said that, quote, "There was no effort to save themselves. They understood that the ship was sinking and that they were needed to keep people calm, and so they just kept playing," end quote. We know one of the songs that was played was "Nearer My God to Thee" because so many people had claimed to hear it. The violin owned and played by Hartley is now on display at a conservation studio in Lugan, Northern Ireland. The violin was recovered 10 days after the wreck along with his body. The instrument has an engraved message from his fiancée that said, quote, "For Wallace on the occasion of our engagement, from Maria," end quote. The captain, Edward John Smith, also went down with the Titanic. There are some accounts, according to historian Tim Moulton, that, quote, "Smith actually took a header dive off of the front of the wheelhouse into the sea and then swam around helping people get to lifeboats. He was actually offered a seat on a lifeboat, but he refused to get on board because he was helping people out. He was completely heroic," end quote. His decision to shut the watertight doors, which have caused the ship to roll onto the side that hit the iceberg, would have caused the ship to go down much quicker. From April 19th to May 25th, 1912, there was an investigation done by the United States, led by Senator William Alden Smith. More than 80 people were interviewed. Witnesses were people such as Second Officer Charles Lightroller, the most senior officer to survive. He defended Captain Smith's decision to not slow down the ship. There were many passengers that talked about the chaos and confusion on the ship, that a warning sound had never gone off. There was also testimony from the crew of the Californian, and this was likely the most scrutinized piece of testimony. The crew said that they saw a boat and they were about 19 miles from the Titanic, but claimed that it was too small to be the Titanic. They tried to contact the moving vessel by using Morse lamp, but their attempts were unsuccessful. Captain Stanley Lord had been aware that rockets had gone off in the distance, but he told the men to keep the radio off and keep using the Morse lamp. According to their account, the boat had sailed away by then. The U.S. investigation found the British Board of Trade at fault, quote, "to whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality," end quote. There were other causes as well, such as the Titanic not being slowed down by the captain. The most powerful criticism, however, was aimed at the Californian, since the ship was, quote, "nearer the Titanic than the 19 miles reported by her captain, and that her officers and crew saw the distress signals of the Titanic and failed to respond to them in accordance with the dictates of humanity, international usage, and the requirements of law," end quote. The British inquiry started in May 1912. The British Board of Trade oversaw it, the same board that had been criticized by the United States. The judge was Sir John Clares Bingham, Lord Mersey. There was not much new evidence that had been discovered during the 28 days in court. The report at the end read the loss of the ship was due to the collision with an iceberg, brought about by the excessive speed at which the ship was being navigated. Mersey also said that he was, quote, "not able to blame Captain Smith. He was doing only that which other skilled men would have done in the same position," end quote. In 1913, the first International Conference for Safety of Life at Sea was called in London. There were rules that were drawn up, such as every ship having lifeboat space for each passenger and crew member on board, that lifeboat drills were mandatory for each voyage, and that due to the Californian not hearing or ignoring the Titanic's distress calls, that there was to be a 24-hour radio watch. The International Ice Patrol was created to warn ships of icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, and was also sent to break up large pieces of ice. There have been many supporters of Captain Lord of the Californian. There is speculation that there was potentially a third ship between the Californian and the Titanic, the Samson, which is a Norwegian boat that was illegally hunting seals. However, the crew members of the Californian should have been able to hear the rockets going off if they were as close as the investigators claimed that they were. Also, passengers in the Titanic stated that at one point a boat was heading toward them, but it's not possible for it to be the Californian, as the Californian was not moving at the time. There's a possibility we may never know the true distance of how far these two boats were from each other. In 1985, an American-French expedition aboard the U.S. Navy research ship Nore was led by Robert Ballard. Part of this expedition was to test Argo, a 16-foot submersible that had a remote-controlled camera on it. It was sent 13,000 feet to the floor of the Atlantic, and the first images recorded of the Titanic after she had sunk under the water were recorded. The video shows the ship laying in two pieces. The stern was terribly damaged, but the bow was recognizable. There was something called rusticles that covered the wreck that were essentially rust-colored stalactites. Scientists surmise it was from iron-eating microorganisms, but in 2019, there had been a great deal more of deterioration to the ship. The ship is located 13 nautical miles from where the distress signals were given off. Expeditions showed no signs of the gash that had downed the ship in the first place, but instead they discovered that the impact had created many thin gashes as well as a fracturing of the brittle metal. There were separation of seams and hull plates which allowed water to flow in. On October 21, 1986, an act was created to designate the Titanic sinking spot as an international maritime memorial. It is laying 12,000 feet beneath the sea. It's called the RMS Titanic Maritime Memorial Act of 1986. There is one individual that I want to address in this episode, and that is First Officer William Murdoch. As most of us know, there is a very famous movie called Titanic that was made in 1997 starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. Near the end, there is a scene where William Murdoch shoots a man, and in regret and guilt, he turns the gun on himself and kills himself. In the film, the director James Cameron had based this on an eyewitness account of a shooting/suicide by an officer during the launching of the lifeboats. There were many survivors that stated they had witnessed this event. In a private letter that first-class survivor Hugh Woolner wrote, quote, "We saw the first officer, Murdoch, twice fire a pistol in the air, ordering a crowd of the crew out of the boat," end quote. Woolner had also testified at the United States Senate inquiry on the Titanic tragedy, and that testimony was what he had also written in his private letter. He said, quote, "There was a sort of scramble on the starboard side, and I looked around and I saw 2 flashes of a pistol in the air. I heard Mr. Murdoch shouting, 'Get out of this! Clear out of this!'" End quote. While Woolner does state that Murdoch shot a gun, it does not indicate that he actually shot a person. There was also another first-class passenger that had said that they had seen an officer shoot a passenger then kill himself. In a letter that George Reams had written to his wife, he said that he witnessed the same thing and stated that the officer committed suicide after he had said, quote, "Gentlemen, each man for himself. Goodbye." End quote. However, nowhere in the letter does it state that the officer was Murdoch. There were several other eyewitness accounts that came forward stating that they had seen the same thing. Only Woolner's account ever said that Murdoch had a pistol, but no one else claimed that Murdoch had shot someone and then himself. There are many individuals that state that Murdoch was a hero, not a villain. He helped many women and children evacuate and was put in charge of lifeboats on the starboard side. He made sure that women and children went first, but any room that was left over, then men could join on the lifeboats. There was a memorial erected of him in his hometown of Dalbeattie. Family members of Murdoch were very upset by the depiction of him in Cameron's Titanic. In 1998, his nephew, Scott Murdoch, said, quote, "From my own family connections, and also from my father having spoken to various officers who survived, he didn't commit suicide. If someone says to you somebody committed suicide when he hadn't, you take objection." End quote. In 2004, Cameron issued a public apology for the depiction of the heroic first officer William Murdoch, after the family had contacted Cameron several times over the portrayal of Murdoch in the film. James Cameron said, quote, "I think I have come to the realization that it was probably wrong to portray a specific person. In this case, First Officer Murdoch as the one who fired the weapon. First Officer Murdoch has a family and they took exception to that, and I think rightly so." End quote. The Titanic's long-lasting impact even affects us still today. The desire and fascination to view and search this century-old shipwreck drives people from all over the world just to catch a glimpse of the enigma that is the Titanic. On June 18, 2023, a submersible called the Titan carried aboard 5 passengers, all hopeful individuals paying the exorbitant fee of $250,000 to see the Titanic in person. On board was Paul-Henri Nargeolet, French submariner and Titanic expert who had visited the wreck more than 30 times since its discovery in 1985, and was the underwater research director to the company that owns the salvaging rights to the Titanic's wreck. One of the other passengers was Stockton Rush, the founder of OceanGate, that had built the submersible Titan. The other 3 occupants were tourists Shahzada Dawood, his son Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding. According to Spanish engineer and underwater expert Jose Luis Martin, he told the Spanish news outlet NIUS, quote, "During the controlled immersion of the Titanic, there must have been an electrical fault, which left the craft without thrust. Without thrust, the weight of the passengers and the pilot, which was focused on the front end close to the viewport, would have disrupted the Titan's longitudinal stability." End quote. Martin believes that the malfunction began at 5,500 feet. Quote, "At this point, the submersible begins to fall headlong towards the seafloor, and with control and safety functions damaged, it can no longer be maneuvered. The pilot couldn't activate the emergency lever to drop weights and return to the surface. The Titan changes position and falls like an arrow vertically. Because the 880 pounds of the passengers are at the porthole unbalanced the submersible. Everyone rushes and crowds on top of each other. Imagine the horror, the fear, and the agony. It had to be like a horror movie." End quote. Martine believes that the entire thing happened within 48 to 71 seconds of freefall. Martine said, quote, "In that period of time, they are realizing everything, and what's more, in complete darkness. It's difficult to get an idea of what they experience in those moments." As it fell to the depths of the ocean, the hull would have been subjected to an increase in water pressure, end quote, which led the hull to be compressed at 9,000 feet under the sea, which caused a microfissure and an implosion. Quote, "After those 48 seconds or 1 minute, the implosion and instantaneous sudden death occurs," end quote. There were structural issues that were cited as one of the causes of the implosion. According to Stefano Brizzolara, an ocean engineer professor at Virginia Tech, said that the carbon fiber the submersible was made of was prone to possible defects and is weaker than other materials. Any leak at that depth would have had water gushing in at a speed of 620 miles per hour, killing everyone instantly. Ironically, in 2021, Stockton Rush told a Mexican travel blogger, Alan Estrada, that he wanted to be remembered as an innovator. He said, quote, "I think it was General Douglas MacArthur who said, 'You're remembered for the rules you break.' You know, I've broken some rules to make the Titan. I think I've broken them with logic and good engineering behind me." End quote. Famous last words. In September of 2024, there were 2 weeks of public testimony at a hearing for the U.S. Coast Guard's investigation into how the submersible imploded in the deep sea. Former employees and executives of OceanGate testified at the hearing. The cone of the submersible was found at the bottom of the Atlantic near the Titanic's bow. David Lockridge, who worked at OceanGate as the Marine Operations Director, had said that Rush had always been more interested in profits rather than safety. He didn't mind using cost-cutting measures in order to get what he wanted. Quote, "The whole idea behind the company was to make money. There was very little in the way of science," end quote. Lockridge had been fired from his role after about 2 years in 2018. He went into a legal battle with OceanGate because he believed that he was unfairly let go due to him complaining about quality control. He ended up filing a quality inspection report regarding the Titan with OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which oversees workplace safety. After Lockridge had gotten fired in 2018, OceanGate had filed a lawsuit against him alleging a breach of contract, that by talking to OSHA, he was discussing confidential information. OSHA didn't press on with his claims. They didn't check the design or the build before the Titan was allowed to descend to the ocean floor. Lockridge said, quote, "I believe that if OSHA had attempted to investigate the seriousness of the concerns I raised on multiple occasions, this tragedy may have been prevented." End quote. That same year that Lockridge was let go, he and OceanGate settled their litigation, and OSHA ended its investigation, which hadn't seemed to have really started in the first place. The American Bureau of Shipping, which gives the go-ahead for whether a marine vessel complies with industry standards, claimed that OceanGate never reached out to the organization. Roy Thomas, an engineer at the American Bureau of Shipping, said that the decision to use carbon fiber, which is mainly used in the aerospace industry, for the main material of the hull was a bad choice, as it could have had fatigue failure in deep sea waters. It's also a costly alternative to titanium, which is what submersible hulls are usually made of. The organization would have never accepted the submersible based on the materials that they used. Tony Neeson, another former engineering executive, had said that he spoke to Rush and told him that the original hull of the Titan, made of experimental carbon fiber, was not going to be able to withstand deep sea pressures. In 2018, the submersible had been struck by lightning and was compromised. Rush fired him after Neeson had refused to approve another test mission. OceanGate also had trouble making payroll, with Rush frequently having to dip into his own money to pay his employees. Marine scientist Stephen Ross testified that the Titan had malfunctioned days before the implosion. Rush had been piloting the vessel and there were others on board, including Ross. There was an issue with the buoyancy, which made the platform shift. The passengers were tumbling around the submersible, and one of them was even hanging upside down. It took them an hour to get out of the water. Bart Kemper of Kemper Engineering Services gave expert testimony of possibilities that could have happened to cause the implosion. He said that the breaking of the carbon fiber hull, or there could have been a manufacturing failure from the acrylic window or the hull. Stockton Rush, who was a businessman that didn't want anything to get into his way, had refused to slow down. Matthew McCoy, who previously worked at Ocean Gate Operations as a technician, had said that he had a meeting with Rush in 2017, and he had asked Rush what would he do if his vessel was under regulatory scrutiny at a U.S. port. McCoy said that, quote, if the Coast Guard became a problem, then he would buy himself a congressman and make it go away, end quote. Soon after that, McCoy resigned. CEO and founder of Hydrospace Group, a submersible maker, had asked Rush about getting the Titan classified by the industry, and Rush, quote, said that the usual response is that it takes too long, it's too expensive, and they don't know about this technology. I don't want to explain my technology, end quote. In a conversation that Lockridge had with Rush before he was fired, Rush had said that he wasn't going to put anyone at risk with the Titan. Quote, everything I've done on this project is people telling me it won't work. You can't do that. It will not happen. I've been fighting this thing since I started this business, and I don't want to fight it with you. And I don't want to put you in a position that you are feeling like you've been badgered into signing off of me going and killing myself. I have no desire to die. I've got a nice granddaughter. I'm going to be around. I understand this kind of risk, and I'm going into with eyes open, and I think this is one of the safest things I will ever do. I have no desire to die, and I'm not going to die, end quote. Even though the tragedy of the Titanic happened over a century ago in 1912, it's still affecting us to this day. It has undoubtedly been one of the most well-documented and well-known disasters of our time. Before I finish this episode, I am going to leave you with a quote said by Titanic survivor Colonel Archibald Grace. Quote, what impressed me at the time that my eyes beheld the horrible scene was a thin, light gray, smoky vapor that hung like a pall a few feet above the broad expanse of sea that was covered with a mass of tangled wreckage. That it was a tangible vapor and not a product of my imagination, I feel well assured. It may have been caused by smoke or steam rising to the surface around the area where the ship had sunk. At any rate, it produced a supernatural effect, and the pictures I had seen by Dante and the description I had read in Virgil of the infernal regions of Charon and the river Lethe were then uppermost in my thoughts. Add to this, within the area described, which was as far as my eyes could reach, there arose to the sky the most horrible sounds ever heard by mortal man, except by those of us who survived this terrible tragedy. The agonizing cries of death from over 1,000 throats, the wails and groans of the suffering, the shrieks of the terror-stricken, and the awful gaspings for breath of those in the last throes of drowning. None of us will ever forget to our dying day. End quote. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, and production and editing is all done by Lauren Powers. Theme song and episode music is done by Mike Myers. You can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.